Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to What Comes Next, Shaping the Future of Graduate Enrollment Management. We're so excited to have you joining us today. While we wait for people to join the webinar, kind of trickle in, I'm going to go over some quick webinar logistics for everyone. So if we can advance to that slide. First, we will have a Q&A period, so please submit questions at any time when they pop into your head. Submit it, but please submit it through the Q&A function so that we can easily find them. If you submit it through the chat, we just can't guarantee that it'll get spotted. So please do submit questions, but please use the Q&A function. This webinar is being recorded. The webinar and the presentation slides will be emailed to all attendees. They'll also be posted to the CGS website, and the recording will be posted to our YouTube channel following the live event. And then, of course, you're always free to use the chat to engage with your other attendees. Conversation is super encouraged. And with that, without further technical ado, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Adrienne Vincent, to introduce the webinar.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome everyone. As many of you know, CGS recently released our latest graduate enrollment and degrees report, which has been published annually since 1986 and presents the findings of the CGS GRE Survey of Graduate Enrollment and Degrees. It's a joint project of CGS and the Graduate Record Examinations Board, or the GRE Board. And among the findings this year are that applications for admission to U.S. graduate schools rose by nearly 4% between fall 2021 and fall 2022. Yet, first-time graduate enrollment fell by about 5% in the same period. The report also shows underrepresented minority groups experienced declining first-time enrollment in the range of 2 to 8%, suggesting a need for additional resources and new approaches to fortify their access to graduate education. And for reference, a link to the report will be added to the chat during the webinar. But this is why I'm pleased that today's webinar will focus on graduate enrollment management, which is always a popular topic and is particularly timely in light of these recent findings. So I'd like to thank Liaison International for their programmatic and financial support for the webinar and for their participation in the CGS Sustaining Membership Network, which allows companies to demonstrate their commitment to graduate education. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Taylor, who will serve as the webinar moderator today and will introduce his fellow panelists. Steve is the Managing Director of BusinessCast and joined Liaison in 2020 after more than 15 years in higher education administration. Serving in leadership roles at institutions like Harvard Business School and Arizona State University, Steve's experience is focused on enrollment management, process and systems efficiencies, and team building. His most recent university position was Associate Dean for Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business, where he led the unit responsible for all graduate business programs. He holds a Master's of Business Administration and a post-baccalaureate degree in philosophy. So without further ado, Steve.
All right, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation and for the outstanding introduction as well. And a big thank you to everybody who's joining us on the webinar today. This is a big conversation, right? This is where we're going to talk about the big things that are kind of shaping the way enrollment works for both the cycle right in front of us as well as for the future. As Adrienne said, I'm Steve Taylor, and I today have the honor as serving as moderator to these outstanding panelists who are going to let us listen in on their conversation. We've got a packed agenda, right? We picked a few big topics here, and I don't want to waste any time with you guys listening to me. I want to get right to the exciting stuff. So let's go ahead and introduce our panelists, which you see here overall. You know what, Julie? Let's see, David will start us off first. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? Anything that you think folks on the webinar should know about you as it shapes your perspective on these conversations?
Great, thanks, Steve. And I'm also excited to be joining my friends on this webinar and all of you joining today virtually. I think we're going to have a great conversation on a number of topics that really are impacting what's going on in enrollment management today and down the future. A little bit about my background. I joined Liaison International about 2 years ago as the Managing Director for Engineering CAS. I have over 25 years in enrollment management. I've worked on both the undergraduate and graduate side of the house. So I have both sides to give as a reference. My last position was at the University of Miami, where I served as Director of Admissions for the College of Engineering for a few years, as you can see on the slide in front of you. As though my focus has been on education and engineering, I've worked in large part on first-generation education in terms of encouraging students, as well as diversity efforts in terms of diversifying student classes, especially in the graduate enrollment field. So again, great seeing everybody, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. All right, let's see. Next up on our introductions list is our friend Julie from Missouri State. Julie, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am thrilled to be here, particularly because it was my interaction with Liaison that gave me the courage to apply to be Dean of the Graduate College at MSU. And it is CGS that has given me the stamina, encouragement, and support to stay in the job rather than quitting on any particular day. So these two groups are very near and dear to my heart. So I'm thrilled to be here. I've been Dean about 9 years at MSU. And you can see a little bit about us, that we have close to 200 graduate programs, including certificates. And we're very blessed that we set another enrollment record this year for the 7th year in a row. I'll talk a little bit about more that later. But you can kind of see that even though I feel like we have a fairly good sized graduate enrollment, we are a small shop when it comes to staff members. And so everything that we talk about and we do, we have to remember that we have to be able to put that on with a fairly small number of folks.
Excellent. All right, Julie, thanks so much. And we all need those people who are going to help us stop quitting on any given day when we're working on a college campus, don't we? Kristen, you get to be the grand slam hitter here for us at the end. You want to wrap up introductions up? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm delighted to see everyone and super excited at the chance to have this conversation. These are challenging times for everyone. I am in my, let's see, I think close to 3rd decade of doing this work. Started right out of college on the way to law school and never made it to law school. I've just spent my entire career on college campuses and have focused specifically on broadening access to STEM degrees. That's my passion. I'm currently at Wentworth in Boston. We have a really robust graduate program, which is part of my portfolio. And I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit about a national organization, CACHE, which is really a chance for colleges and universities with strong engineering programs to partner together. And Grad CACHE is an offshoot of that. So you'll hear a little bit more from me about that as we advance the conversation. Back to you, Steve.
Excellent. This is so exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and pause my sharing here so that we can just focus on the discussion instead. So now that we know who we're talking to, we can go ahead and jump into it, right? The theme of today is something kind of around the trends, the big changes, the challenges shaping the way enrollment happens. And when I say that, I mean the different ways that we recruit students, retain them throughout the pipeline, and yield them into actual students who have positive outcomes. There are a ton of issues in there, right? We can't possibly capture all of them. So like I said in the beginning, we've got a couple of big topics to take on here that we think together start to bring things into focus around how complicated enrollment management is right now. We're going to start this first topic off with you, Julie, about perhaps the most talked about subject of the last year, artificial intelligence. So let me give you a little bit of a wind up here. There are a million conversations about the way artificial intelligence is going to change our world. Lots of those conversations have been active for decades, but I think this year, ChatGPT really kind of showed a lot of people that the change we're going to see is a lot closer than they might have initially thought. Services like this continue to improve, and they call into question a lot of the things we look at when we look at an application. Things like the reliability of the essay responses and the impact that that might have on things like holistic admissions. So help us paint the picture here. How do you see the role of AI tools like ChatGPT shaping some of the ways we evaluate candidates? You know, does it matter if they use a support tool to help them through a response to an essay? Will we see similar tools like this on the evaluation side? Help us paint the picture. What do you think, Julie, AI is going to do for us?
So the first point that I would like to make is that the reason I was chosen to be first responder on this topic is not at all because I am an expert on AI or machine learning. but because during the planning meeting, I said, when this issue first came up on our campus early last spring, I thought it was very straightforward and everyone would just agree with what I thought the campus approach should be. And I look around the room of about 50 academic leaders, and maybe 2 visibly agreed with me. Many visibly disagreed with me. And there was a handful that just sat there going, what's ChatGPT? So I say that because I think that we're still all over the place. So Sarah, if you could launch that poll, I'm interested in thinking, where are we on this topic with this group? So do you agree the use of AI to generate a first draft of a personal statement for an application to a grad program is acceptable? So what do you think? And then I think Sarah's going to share results when they come in, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great.
So this is a big one of like where the rubber meets the road, honestly, trying to get a sense of how people really think about this. I'm so interested to see what the results say. All right, so it looks like we're going to take a moment or so to have those responses come in. Sarah will get those to pop up for us as soon as they're done. Be excited to see what this is looking like. There we go. Okay, Julie, can you see that on the screen?
Yes.
All
And
right.
honest to goodness, I just feel like CGS, these are my brothers and sisters, but I did not ask them to respond this way. But this is exactly what I predicted. Look, everybody, in this particular meeting at this particular time, we are indeed all over the place. And that's what we have found. That's certainly what I have found to be the case. That was the case in that room, except it was mainly people who didn't agree with me. And this is what we're seeing now. So this is highly unusual, right, for faculty to disagree on something. So this is typical. And even though we are focusing on how AI ML affects the application process, it really is, regardless of what the particular use is, faculty and staff, students are all over the place on this. So I'm old enough to remember very vividly having to calculate an ANOVA by hand before I was allowed to access SPSS on the mainframe, because it couldn't possibly be okay to run stats on a computer. You had to know how to do it. That'd be crazy in today's world, unless you're a quant person and you are developing software for SPSS or some other company. We really just count on SPSS and JASP to do, and other packages to do this for us. We have to understand the principles behind it, but we don't have to do it by hand or the math ourselves anymore. Another example is laptops in the classroom. I can remember when that first came out and people were very concerned about, they're just going to be surfing the web. They're not really going to use it for the right academic reason. And now that's not even a thing anymore. So keep in mind that although perspectives are different on this, I think they are changing as rapidly as the technology is changing. Inside Higher Ed notes this pretty drastic change in response to one of their surveys from May until this fall, just in a 4 or 5 month period. The willingness to consider its use has changed quite a bit. So perspectives are already changing. So here are my few points and my advice. I think campus leaders, graduate deans, leaders in graduate education on campuses should be at the forefront of encouraging the appropriate use of this new technology. And this is challenging, but where did you first hear about ChatGPT? I did at last year's December CGS meeting, when Louis Van On told us that you could be upset about it if you want, but it is here to stay. Now, how can we as leaders support the best, most desirable use of AI? And recognizing the fact that the best, most desirable use will vary based on the discipline and the application to which it could be in play. And AI in the arts is particularly challenging. So that's one point. The other pieces that step into the most desirable best are, you have to think about access and equity. So if use of the most sophisticated AI programs, if use involves a cost, then inequities can result. So what is your campus or your organization doing to address potential inequities of access to tool use? And then finally, Steve, you mentioned about, will we be using AI on our end to streamline some of our admissions or other processes? Well, there certainly are fairly routine applications, and these are in some of the references that I provided, such as transcript reading that are done by humans, that all you're doing is checking a GPA or something like that. AI holds a lot of promise in that. But again, hearkening back to something I learned at a CGS meeting, this was last summer, be cautious about using AI to screen in or screen out applicants based on a predictive model. If you have not read Weapons of Math Destruction, I would absolutely encourage you to do so. Again, I first heard about this book last July, and I read it, and it really caused me to do some pretty serious thinking. In a nutshell, if predictive models are set up without being mindful of potential discriminating factors in there, and if they aren't set up to learn and adapt based on as data come in, then you really are vulnerable to setting up stereotypes, perpetuating stereotypes, and disadvantaging groups of people unfairly. So be cautious about that and mindful. And again, read that book for more information. Another big point is I think it's critical for faculty, again, associations, et cetera, to be explicit in their expectations regarding AI. So another recent article from Inside Higher Ed talked about how many of us are anxious and we don't know what to do about it and what's it going to be like. And they suggest establishing advisory boards or advisory committees. I think this is a great idea because you can bring in industry experts, both from the perspective of their experts in AI and ML, but also they're the experts in who are going to be employing our students in the future. So they can serve as advisors to tell us, we really want your students learning about this because when they get in our shop, they're going to learn to need it. And then having students and faculty involved, absolutely critical. Here's a very quick example. In my at my institution, this access and equity was really at the forefront of discussions, and we were very concerned that what can the campus provide so that everybody has access to something. And so we were going through various options and packages, et cetera, and costs. And then someone said, has someone talked to the Student Government Association about this? And when we did, we found out that their perception on that day, in that week, was that the majority of faculty were telling them they cannot use it. So we were about to invest a significant amount of money to make sure that students had access, when right now the majority of the faculty, or again, that was 2 weeks ago, that could be very different today. They were hearing from a majority of faculty that they didn't want to use it. So you got to make sure that you have everybody at the table. And then finally, campus leaders should do their best to keep up with what's going on in AI and ML and how it can be used in our processes, including from our standpoint. It's not just enough to tell our applicants or our students how to use it, but how can we use it? And I got to tell you, even saying those words gives me such anxiety because it is changing all the time. So that's why I'm glad we have a community. You know, I'm surrounded by CGS peeps. Liaison has great resources out on this. Like I said, Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, you know, you could read an article every day, but that is a comfort to me, knowing that I'm not the only person that has to keep up with it. So those are my thoughts, Steve. Back to you.
Oh, Julie, I love it. I don't know if I've put these words together in a sentence before, but provocative and pragmatic, right? This idea that like you need to have an understanding, a vision for what the best and highest use is, plus some qualifiers, right? This applies to students, to faculty, to administrators, to kind of minding the way that access happens. Oh my God, Kristen and David, what do you guys think? What's your response to that? Kristen, do you want to go first? What do you think about this idea that, sure, this is big and scary, but if we build a vision and get some pragmatic steps involved, we can make it work for us? What's your response?
So in the spirit of full disclosure, when we were having this conversation leading up to this event, I confessed that I had used ChatGPT to craft a division-wide memo some late night when I was running out of brain power. And that was instructive for a couple of reasons. I, as an English and religion major took a dim view of using technology to do the writing. I pride myself on that craft, and yet also the pragmatic side of me recognized that there was a place for this tool. And I guess my challenge to all of us would be to use it in our own work once or twice before we make a final decision about its appropriateness. I think that's the loaded word, right? So Julie, part of what you said was we need to be at the forefront of determining what is appropriate. And there are many, many ways that we might define that on our respective campuses. But I think a piece of this is going to require us to actually dip our toe into the AI water.
Yeah, interesting. David, what do you think? What's your sense of this?
You're just following along with that same sentiment. Technology is always something that's going to continue to change. And the reality is the students of today are way more tech savvy than any of us that are sitting on as panelists on today's, in my opinion, my personal opinion. As somebody who was in school at a time when there wasn't a thing called a laptop computer. And I remember when faculty first were approached by having this device in the room, they're like, no, we can't have that. Students are going to cheat. Students are not going to pay attention. They're going to watch videos. They're not going to play games. And the reality is today on almost every college campus, you can't walk into any classroom without seeing laptops open, and there's no paper or pen on the desk. Everything is done on the laptop. So the reality is technology does impact our lives. It's a matter of knowing how it can be used, putting in guidelines, as Kristen just said, in terms of how it should be used. But I think it is something that, again, to what Julie said, a year ago, nobody was really talking about ChatGPT. And that's, you can't escape any day without having it on the news and conversations, how you use it in your daily life. So I think it's going to continue to evolve. And I think we'll look back on this in 5 years and we'll say, oh, yeah, ChatGPT, that was nothing. What's the next thing?
I think the other piece, I should have said this earlier, Steve, that one of the things that's also important is when we're coaching potential users, that ChatGPT is indeed a mixture of fact and fiction. And not that we've ever seen anything like this as faculty members before AI came on this screen, but sometimes it just makes stuff up, and it'll like make up citations that never happened or quotes that no one ever said. And again, not that we didn't see that before, but it's so much easier to see that now. So I think it's really important for us to be very proactive in working with our students, our applicants, to be aware of this. And it'll sound authentic, but the buck stops with you in the end, what you submit. And remember, it needs to be real, yours, but also just real in general. So I think that's another point to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's a great point. I was curious about ChatGPT in the beginning and asked it to write an article for me on the top 10 ranked MBA programs. And it listed out the top 10 ranked MBA programs. And the number 2 program that it ranked was Western Hawaii University's MBA program. And I thought, doesn't sound right. There is no such thing as Western Hawaii University. It just totally made up an institution. And so it's a really good point. And then Catherine in the chat said something really interesting that I think bears some conversation here. It's this idea of tools like ChatGPT in this kind of AI space as kind of an equalizer, right? So we all know, having been on the receiving end of graduate applications, that some people obviously have help. Some candidates can afford and have the networks and are able to build out an application that just blows you away with what is a fairly standard candidacy. And now these tools kind of break that apart and give everybody access to a little bit of an expert there. But it does bring us back full circle around to that poll that asks this question about how comfortable are we with using these kinds of tools as part of the representation of a candidacy. And I just can't help but wonder what will happen, to your point of everything kind of constantly changing and being dynamic, what this conversation will look like, not next year, but in 3 months. Okay, so that's a big one. We've taken up a chunk of time in the beginning here. There's so much more to talk about. So I'm gonna shift us off of the artificial intelligence conversation, and David, I'm gonna push us into the next conversation here. I'm gonna ask you to take kind of a tactical take for us here, right? This year, the whole industry, a lot of school enrollment professionals were kind of totally thrown for a loop when the SCOTUS decision was released, saying you absolutely cannot consider race as any part of the admissions kind of conversation here. And there's been a broad range of responses we've seen to that ruling. A lot of the schools we've talked to have said, we're going to use this moment to try to refocus our efforts on the diversity and inclusion initiatives that we know can have some kind of impact here. So what's your sense on the pragmatic side? Like, how do schools make an impact or make progress at all the different stages of recruitment to try to improve representation, right? If we want to open the top of the funnel to new audiences and kind of support better yield activities, how do we have the ops conversation about how to do this in the recruitment and enrollment space?
I think this is going to be an interesting insight because this was probably the most anticipated decision before the Supreme Court released it earlier this year. But most people really thought they knew what the answer was going to be. And in that case, it was the same decision that the court ruled, which is that race cannot be used in the evaluation of applications for the purpose of admission. But it meant that schools were going to have to make changes. And I think that process of change is kind of, the buzzword for enrollment management. Is this the new normal? Yes, the new normal is change. And so we always need to be able to be adaptable to that change. And this is just another piece of that. Certainly, institutions have been building upon how they were going to go out and create diversity and access and equity in attracting students to their programs. So there were a lot of things in place. And this decision really made them have to reconsider some of the changes. And I'm wondering before I go a little bit further, like what are all of you thinking and hearing about on your campuses in terms of how much change did you have to go through in order to think about how you're going to recruit students this next cycle? So Steve, if we can bring up the poll, perhaps we can get some feedback from everybody on our webinar today. So did your admissions process change as a result of the SCOTUS decision? So if I ask you all to give a vote, did it significantly change, somewhat change, didn't change at all? Or perhaps some of you are on the call and say, I don't really know because I'm not responsible for that, but I wanted to come to the webinar anyway.
I mean, David, this is honestly my favorite question so far because you and I had conversations about there were schools that stopped, 100% stopped all graduate admissions. And like everybody nods and makes that smile face because it gives you that tightness in your chest. Like, wait, we're going to stop all graduate admissions just so that they could figure out what was happening versus all the schools that have been operating this way for, 5, 6, 7 years in some states. Oh, I'm so
and the change is not black and white, Steve. To your point, there were schools that I talked to last week that are still, talking to their legal department because they haven't been able to release their January admit pool. And so, it has major ramifications without having to be able to have the rules set in place. And again, I think that's where that change piece comes in. We're going to continue to feel that change. So let's see what everybody had to say. So significantly changed, only 7% of you said that. Somewhat changed, 32%. Didn't change, 48%. I don't know, 14%. So there was a lot more I don't knows than I expected. But with that being said, the poll is actually along the lines that we're hearing from most cases, is that as much as there was lots of conversations about how the SCOTUS decision was going to make a change in the admissions process, the majority of institutions reporting in many different polls, as well as our poll today, is that it didn't really change their process at all. And many times that's as a result of, if you think about what is going on for the admissions process in state institutions, that's really mandated by the central operations and their capitals in terms of that. So many state schools already had eliminated race as a tool in terms of shaping their class. The change is going to be, I think, not just in the admissions process, but what else is going into the landscape. And I think that's really part of this conversation that I'd like to sort of point out to everybody. Reporting on what we just looked at, if you looked at a report that came out last week in Inside Higher Education, 2/3 of everybody reporting that they're concerned about what this is going to have as an impact. And I think it's actually enlightening, given the information that our friends at CGS shared before, is that minority enrollment in graduate programs was down 2 to 8% this year, which was prior to the decision. So what impact at all is this going to have? We were already down 2 to 8% in enrollment this fall without having to deal with any of the ramification or implications of what admissions are going to have to do this year. How is that going to change? And it's not just a matter of how you review the applications. Many people are taking this as an opportunity to look in broad brushes. But I think the other thing is, There are lots of people that agree with that. There was also a similar survey that came out that was specific to college presidents. And I think it was something really interesting that came out, and I shared it earlier in our conversation with Steve and I, is that 59% believe, college presidents believe that SCOTUS will have an impact, whether or not their campus had anything they had to change on their campus. They still believe that the SCOTUS decision is going to impact it. But for all my enrollment management friends on here who hear all the time about, are you going to make your class? And everybody's saying they're going to make their class. And then somehow some of them make it and others are like, well, what happened? We didn't make our class. You know, we, again, CGS data pointed out that even though the applications were up, enrollment was down. Well, those college presidents saying, although they believe, over 50% of them, that there's going to be an impact, your presidents were saying that 86% believe there's going to be no changes to diversity on your campuses. So for all my friends in enrollment management, get ready. There's no change going to happen to you. That's the expectation of your presidents and provosts. It's almost, well, what can we do? So again, I think it's something that obviously you're looking at now, but let's think about what else we need to be looking at. And I think that's really the whole enrollment funnel. I said it early in my opening remarks, it really is about change. So obviously we start at the beginning and people say, well, when is that, David? And I think it could be down the road in many different ways. It's really making those connections and using data to be able to make those decisions. So the top of the funnel is really where we all think about that whole process. But in terms of what are we inputting to be able to reach out to underrepresented populations? You know, what are we using? Are we buying lists? Are we going to certain fairs? How are we going to be able to do that? And so the prospect pool is a big part of that process in terms of being able to build it. At the end of the line, what students say in underrepresented populations is that they want to have a sense of belonging. They need to feel that the institution, that is a connection. And it goes back to what I call Enrollment 101, which is, why does the student want to go to your institution? It's because they feel that that institution is someplace they can see themselves enrolling, that they have a program that they're interested in, that the research that's going to be done is what they want to take as their lifelong passion as they pursue their PhD. So I think, again, refocusing on what is your messaging at the beginning of the funnel in terms of what is it that, what's your mission, what are you going to do, what are you going to provide the students, and really have those conversations. And to engage the many different participants on your campus that can impact that. We know that the single most important factor of whether or not a student will select, especially in the PhD population, is that faculty relationship with the applicant. And so, although many institutions have broadened the amount of faculty input that has been involved in the review process, not all institutions really had made that shift to it. And so in conversations that I've had lately, one of the best things that I'm hearing is that they're trying to engage faculty more often in terms of those conversations. And so being able to do that really can open up the pool, not only at the top of the funnel, like who do I know, who are my friends out and other institutions around, in terms of reaching out to them. So opening that pool up. But it's also looking at probably what I call the single most hidden source, and that is your alumni and your current students. And so there are a lot of graduate programs pre-pandemic and especially during pandemic started looking especially for MS studies in terms of whether or not they could do some sort of accelerated pathway to getting a degree program. And so that's one of the other things that schools are looking at. But it's also looking at alumni. Alumni are, again, your single voice. They're the ones that are going to have the best voice. And it's not just the people that have graduated 20 years ago and have a rosy picture of what college campus life was like, but somebody that's graduated in the last 5 to 7 years. Again, because that's the population of students that you may be working with. Yes, the graduate population is increasingly getting much more diverse in terms of age as well. But again, getting students and alumni involved in that process. Building the pipeline, though, can start at an earlier point, and that really is in terms of using summer research programs that you may have on your college campus. I know a lot of STEM schools have that already in terms of inviting students to do research, but really utilizing and leveraging them as a tool to reach out to students to talk about getting involved in education on their campus as a full-time student. There's been a number of schools, and another conference I went to where the school is actually have the Summer Institute, have them go through an easy sort of application during that Summer Institute. And when the student leaves, not only are they leaving with some sort of certificate that said that they came and did research and that they had that experience to put into their resume and their application, they're leaving with an offer of admission when they leave that college campus. So it is really, again, thinking outside the box about how we might be able to reach students, especially that are underrepresented in the populations right now. Affinity groups is another part of that in terms of reaching out to affinity groups. So whether or not that's specialty discipline affinity groups, or whether or not it's looking at beyond your scope. Many times in the graduate world, because of staffing and funding, certainly compared to what the undergraduate populations do, we're not traveling as much. We're not going as far. We don't have as many feet on the ground. So how do you maximize those opportunities? And associations are a great way to be able to input in with that. But looking at, for instance, at HBCUs or for historically Black institutions or HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, those are great resources in terms of being able to interface with those campuses across the country and the fairs that they're doing to recruit students. Or programs like the McNair Scholars that really does target underrepresented student populations. A lot of schools will get the list, but in a survey that was done last year, there's a lot of information that we buy the list and we go at one time and then we drop the list. And so it's, again, re-looking at your enrollment marketing plans throughout the funnel in terms of reaching out to these students. And the message has to be specific. Having student stories is another part of that. Technology, just like we talked before about AI and technology, having those bots to help students during the application process, but also in terms of webinars to be able to do that. These are all things that can be done. Many times the focus is, though, at the top of the funnel in terms of getting the students in the funnel. Yes, we need them there. But again, to the point of whether or not students are enrolling and whether or not the students from underrepresented populations are enrolling in particular, that really is a large part in the yield. And that's where a lot of schools saw problems this year in terms of enrolling that class was on the yield side. And so talking to schools right now, there's a lot of focus in terms of what can we do to really refocus that yield. Many times in graduate programs, the yield process has been focused very specifically as understood in the PhD realm, because again, that research needs to be done. So we really need to yield those students so that those research projects can continue. And very little has been done in terms of yielding MS students. So schools are really re-looking at that. They may be sort of gathering what they've done on the undergraduate side that has worked for them and perhaps applying it to it. But I would caution people that you can't use the same message. You really need to reshape that message in terms of, again, going back to access and equity programming. The other challenge, very honestly, in this DEI world, in light of the Supreme Court, is how broadly based people are also scoping it in terms of saying, well, we can't have centers on campus. We can't have certain scholarships or financial aid programs on campus, even though the Supreme Court decision was specifically about using race in the admissions review process. So I know for some of you, that's going to be an additional challenge. But again, going back to Julie's point before, using liaison communities or CGS, thinking about best practices, that's a big part of it. I'm looking to see if there's anything that came up in the webinar piece. So, Julie said, thanks for mentioning the messaging and creating an environment of belonging. Again, at the end of the day, it's the message. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that we rely on ChatGPT to do that messaging. I think the messaging should be coming from the students and the faculty that are engaged in these programs, because they are the voice of your programs. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to make all the difference. But again, I think schools are going to have to reevaluate in terms of what are they doing for those students, not only at the top of the funnel, what are we going to do to yield them? And dare I say, double down on any efforts that you have to retain those students. Because we all know how hard it is to recruit students. A lot of effort has not necessarily been put into retaining students. And you may be asking what that is, and that really is to create pathways within your graduate program. So for instance, for your MS students, potentially to go on to PhD programs. Again, using your marketplace you've already established to help build your graduate programs at every level of their programs.
Oh, David, you are putting it down, man. I think we're all picking it up here. I want to open it up just because I feel like as a higher ed nerd, I'm coming out of my skin. This is so great. This is such a big topic, right? I think every single person on this webinar was drawn to higher ed in some sense because they feel that obligation to open up the doors to these transformational institutions to anyone who might want access to it, right? And so this idea that you need to build a community, that you need to, not just of people, but of organizations, of resources. Kristen and Julie, what jumped out to you in David's remarks that like, okay, yes, or, oh, no, definitely not that. Like what jumps out? Kristen, you unmuted first. What do you think?
I will say I was taking notes as you were talking, David. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. And the data point you shared at the beginning about the fact that even before the decision was rendered, there was a drop. Higher ed has over the years been perceived as an unwelcoming place for many people, depending on your background. And I think the perception, you used the word perception multiple times, is now, I think, even more of a barrier for some of those individuals. And as you were talking about building community, what came to mind is this recruitment process now in the wake of the decision requires more effort in terms of building trust, which is more labor intensive, right? So it will require more boots on the ground. It will require more engagement from folks who have credibility, the alumni and the students. So really not taking issue with anything you said, just underscoring and sort of reframing in terms of that need to show that we can be trusted as places that will allow these students to thrive.
Yeah, Julie, what do you think?
Yeah, so I really like the fact that, David points out that normal is change now, and we're used to that. The comment that I would add is that the SCOTUS decision was certainly on everybody's radar, a big piece of news, but in my state, the SCOTUS decision really it paled in comparison to local and state efforts that are to be far more conservative when it comes to issues like this. So, keeping our perspective that in order to offer a quality education, having a diverse student body is a critical obligatory component. So if we continue to focus on that, then the work that we're doing, we've had to tweak some of the wording in some of the work that we're doing, but the basic work in terms of how are we marketing, recruiting, and are our materials inclusive, welcoming? And what about the metrics that we're using? What are the pros and cons, and which ones can potentially be discriminatory? And what are, again, pros and cons? And then what are the processes we're using to make decisions? And we continue this work despite the SCOTUS decision or any of our state and local initiatives. It's important work. It's important for the quality of education we're able to provide. Then one more piece is got to know your data. So in my case, our yield is actually good, even with underrepresented groups. In some cases, some of the underrepresented groups yield higher than the majority groups. So in our case, what we've done is we've really focused our efforts. We need to cast a broader net. Now, maybe when we do that, our yield will go down, which is okay with me. But you need to know where to put your efforts, and only your data will tell you that. Back to you.
Oh, I hate that I have to pull us away from this because this is a great conversation. We had we've got a couple of fantastic conversations here in the chat happening here. And thank you, Kristen, for responding. This notion that like, was there some signaling happening before the actual decision that had an impact? And I totally agree with Kristen here. I think that the most complicated part potentially of that decision was the signaling that happened to people who won't reach out to someone at all now because they think, oh, there's not place for me. Again, I have to pull us away from this. Okay, Kristen, I'm going to stick with you though. And this will be our final big topic to talk about. And my apologies, it's huge, right? This is big. So many schools that we talked to this year reported two complicated regional challenges. The first one was, oh my God, how do I get international students to continue to pay attention to my programs given things like home country competition, geopolitical instability, the difficulty getting visas, getting a job afterward, all those different pieces. That was part one. Part two was, are there still US domestic students out there? Do they exist? Can we still enroll them? So help us paint the picture here as you see the kind of the complexity of trying to use these kind of big giant groups, right? International versus domestic is a pretty giant set of categories. But how do we figure out how to stabilize these populations, recruit these populations? How do we work through the complexity here? What do you think?
Great question and topic. I'm sorry we don't have 2 hours to dive in. I'm actually going to have us take a step back even further, and I'm going to talk for just a second about the hyperdynamic environment that we're working in. And it almost feels to me like we've all been cast into one of those reality shows, like this is grad enrollment survivor, right? Who gets out alive? Or who's getting voted off the island, or who wants to be voted off the island themselves, maybe to Western Hawaii universities. The macro trends are creating challenges for graduate enrollment, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And this has implications for both domestic and international recruitment. So obviously on the supply side, we've all been talking ad nauseum about the demographic cliff and the demographic shift. So that is driving down both headcount and revenue. It's also increasing competition as we get more aggressive in trying to make the class, as David noted. Declining undergraduate net tuition revenue, which is happening at many, many places across the country, is then putting more pressure on those of us charged with meeting grad enrollment goals, because if you can't make the balance sheet work on the undergrad side, you're going to try to do that if you're a CFO with grad enrollment. The rapid growth of all the online options, we've talked a lot about technology, that's driving down the cost. So if you're a bricks and mortar program, that's going to make discounting a new adventure for your institution. And then general skepticism. We talked about how the SCOTUS decision was received by a lot of the disenfranchised groups. The truth of the matter is, your general person on the street has a high degree of skepticism about the value of higher education, about the cost of higher education, whether or not we're actually going to deliver on our promise, whether or not there are hidden fees. All of that plays into the reluctance of many to pursue an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree. And then the international market, as you've just described, has been shaky at best. The macro trends on the demand side, I'm just going to be Debbie Downer for one more minute here, and then we're going to shift. The labor shortage obviously has compelled employers to be more flexible about who they're hiring and what credentials they expect from those folks. And they've had to get creative on the industry side in terms of credentialing and skilling up individuals, especially as technology has advanced so quickly that they have needed to resort to short form credentialing, whether or not that's certificates or badges or licenses, to plug the holes in their respective operations. So those just-in-time skills have, again, potentially suppressed demand for some of our tried and true graduate programs. So that's a wind up to the big question. And that is whether or not we could use all this disruption to our advantage. And could we, in our respective roles at whatever college or university we're affiliated with, could we perhaps do things a little differently and address some sacred cows? Higher ed has a really convoluted way of delivering, making decisions, of delivering degrees. And there are, from, I think, a practitioner standpoint, always opportunities to be more efficient. I just, for a moment of context, wanted to call up I have two quick poll questions. I described this before as kind of like a wine pairing. These two questions are linked. So if we could just see the first one, and then as soon as you answer that, we're going to pop up the second poll for you. So the first question, I'm curious to know if your grad enrollment target for next fall is higher than it was for this fall. Higher, lower, or the same?
This is the question I'm most interested in, Kristen, because most of the people I talk to, after a few minutes, they say, we barely made this class and we've been asked to get more next year. So I'm curious to know if it's mostly my conversations or if this is the field overall. This is a great question.
Yeah, and Julie and I are at institutions who have been fortunate enough to see growth. We're up 16% year over year, and yet it does feel a lot like, what have you done for us lately? Or, as Julie and I were commiserating earlier, if you pulled a rabbit out of your hat this year, there's no reason not to expect us to do it again next year. So the 10% where your goal is lower than this current fall, I am so envious. The preponderance, no surprise, is either the same or higher. So that's very, very helpful. And then my part 2 poll has to do with resources. Whether or not, I know this is almost a comical question, right? Were you given more money? Who has more money in their budget to bring in that class for next year? Or less, or the same? I will share from my standpoint, it feels like the same is the new up, right? Like if your budget isn't cut, you're expected to express gratitude.
Right. I just spoke to a school this morning who said, we need help figuring out how we can do a lot more with the same exact set of resources. And I thought, oh, what a lovely way of saying that, That's a tough
Yes.
charge.
So we'll wait just a second for those results, and then I will wrap up with a couple of thoughts about our way forward. Okay, so not being cut is good. We are all in different ways revenue generating, so I think that's smart. But interesting that the preponderance of respondents said we're being asked to do more, but only 6% got more money to make the magic happen. So one might argue we're all too good at our jobs, right? So we're enabling. This is enabling behavior. What I will say in terms of advice for the way forward is it feels to me like that old mantra, publish or perish, should now be partner or perish. That we are not going to be able to be successful going forward. I'm not thinking next year. I'm thinking really the next decade. Ways to collaborate, unless we figure out, are there alliances we can make on our campuses? Are there alliances we can make with industry and with other institutions with maybe comparable missions? Maybe we can complement with each other and offer programs that will dovetail in a more systemic way than has been the case in the past. So some intentionality around who we are partnering with and what we are doing to improve the student experience. So that is sort of my closing thought, that partner or perish should be our new mantra.
Oh, be still my heart. I love it so much. This is great. As always happens with these conversations, we're so rapidly running out of time. So David and Julie, give you 30 seconds to respond to Kristen's comments on complexity here. What do you think?
I appreciate Kristen saying, because I bet a lot of folks can identify with this notion that every time you increase enrollment, the expectation is to do it again next year. And just here's a very quick example. I checked these numbers before I wanted to share them with you, but we went in one of my master's programs from 23 one fall, 28 one fall to 136, 168. We can't continue to do that. I love that program so much. I honest to God sent them donuts. And there have been other programs that have stepped up in really meaningful ways. And usually it is because some sort of partnership with a foreign institution, international institution. That's not, we can't keep, I mean, I can't continue to promise that every year. So we have to look at other kinds of collaborative partnerships. And I think Kristen's right on the money. That's what's going to, I think, help us continue to grow.
Excellent.
And just my quick comment is, Kristen, I love that partner or perish, partner or perish. And I think it's timely, not only in terms of all the topics that we've talked about today, but certainly in being able to bring the community together in this webinar. Thanks to our friends at CGS, and obviously for those of us that work liaison to work with two people that we consider friends and partners in the higher ed space. So I agree with you. Partnerships are key to our future.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do my screen share again as we wrap up here, and want to give a big thank you to Kristen, David, and Julie for kind of guiding us through this conversation. There's so much more that we could talk about here. It's painful to stop almost, but a couple of quick notes for our audience. We'll have some liaison friends at the CGS Annual this year, hosting a session on one of our topics today, kind of improving diversity and access in higher education. We hope that we will see you there. And of course, we've got some materials on how we think artificial intelligence is impacting some of the ways that review happens in the admissions process. So we'll make sure that you get a link to that as well. So on behalf of our panelists, on behalf of Liaison, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to our friends from CGS to wrap us up here and take us all the way out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen, for facilitating an absolutely phenomenal conversation. We kind of blitzed right past it, but they have an ebook, which I just popped the link for that in the chat. But thank you so, so much for facilitating this great conversation. We had a lot to get through, so I know we didn't get to everybody's comments and questions. So hopefully you will join us at the annual meeting. We can go to, I believe, the next slide. Thank you, which is December 6th through 9th, 2023, and it will be held in Washington, D.C. We have a bunch of really great sessions, including pre-meeting workshops, and I can think of one right off the top of my head that is specifically looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion following the SCOTUS decision. We also, as we mentioned earlier, we have our new graduate enrollment and degrees report is out. That's available on our website. And then just finally, I want to invite all of our CGS members to an upcoming webinar, Building a Healthy Research Culture. That'll be November 2nd from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, and you can also register for that on our website. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded, so you will get that recording emailed to you in the next week or so. It'll also be uploaded to our YouTube channel and to our website, so you can go back, rewatch, share with colleagues, do all those great things there. And with that, thank you so very much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at our next events.